From the ashes of one sister's destruction, a global movement was born that would transform how the world viewed human difference and potential. After losing Rosemary to medical barbarism and family shame, Eunice Kennedy Shriver quietly made a sacred promise to herself. No family would ever suffer this particular pain again. No child would be hidden away simply because they were different from societal expectations. And this solemn promise would give birth to one of history's greatest disability rights movements, touching millions of lives across every continent. But this movement began with pain that cut to the very core of human experience, pure, deep, soul-crushing heartbreak that would have destroyed a lesser person. In 1942, 20-year-old Eunice Kennedy made her first visit to St. Coletta Institution in Wisconsin, traveling by train through the endless farmland that surrounded her sister's place of exile. A full year had passed since she last saw Rosemary at the family compound in Hyannisport, and she had no idea what to expect from this reunion. A year ago, there was still a Rosemary who could speak in simple sentences, smile with genuine warmth, recognize her siblings with obvious joy. There was still someone who laughed at family jokes she didn't fully understand, who danced awkwardly but enthusiastically at family gatherings, who wrote letters from London filled with innocent happiness. Now, the person sitting in the institutional wheelchair in front of her was completely different, utterly transformed by surgical intervention that had stolen her very essence. Eunice looked at her sister's face, searching desperately for any trace of the person she had known and loved, and found nothing familiar. Rosemary stared at her with empty eyes that held no spark of recognition, no hint of the personality that had once animated her features. Her face was slack, expressionless, as if someone had simply turned off the lights behind her eyes. "Hello, Rosemary, I'm Eunice," she said, her voice trembling with hope and fear in equal measure. Silence filled the sterile visiting room like a physical presence. "Your sister, Eunice. Do you remember our childhood together? Do you remember the games we used to play?" Again, nothing but devastating silence that seemed to mock the very idea of memory or connection. At that moment, sitting in that cold institutional room surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the distant sounds of other damaged lives, Eunice grasped the full magnitude of the truth that her family had been hiding. Rosemary hadn't just been lost to illness or accident, she had been deliberately killed by people who claimed to love her. Not physically murdered, but spiritually, mentally, and emotionally executed with surgical precision. Her personality had been carved away like unwanted tissue, leaving behind only a breathing shell. And her family, including Eunice herself, had allowed it to happen through silence, complicity, and cowardice. Eunice was crying when she left St. Coletta that gray Wisconsin day, tears streaming down her face as she walked through the parking lot toward her waiting car. But these weren't just tears of grief for a sister she had lost, though that pain was overwhelming. They were also tears of rage that burned like acid in her chest, rage at her own family for choosing image over humanity, at her father for making such a monstrous decision without consultation, at the conspiracy of silence that had enabled this tragedy. And most of all, rage at herself for her own complicity, for failing to ask the right questions, for accepting the family's lies, for not fighting harder to protect the sister who had needed her most. Because she too had remained silent when silence was complicity. She too had failed to protect Rosemary when protection was desperately needed. But as she drove away from that institution, making her way back through the endless cornfields toward the larger world, Eunice made a vow that would define the rest of her life. She would never remain silent again about the treatment of people with intellectual disabilities. She would spend every remaining day of her life fighting to ensure that no other family would face the impossible choices that had destroyed Rosemary. Eunice's mission began quietly, almost secretly, because she knew that open rebellion against her family's approach would be immediately shut down by her father's iron will and political calculations. In the early 1950s, she started visiting other institutions across the country, driving to remote facilities where families had hidden their disabled children away from public view. She met with families who had made the same impossible choices as the Kennedys, parents who carried the same burden of shame and secrecy, Siblings who wondered what had become of brothers and sisters who had simply disappeared from family narratives. She talked to researchers who were studying intellectual disabilities in university laboratories, doctors who were developing new approaches to treatment and education, advocates who were beginning to challenge the assumption that institutionalization was the only option for families facing cognitive differences. What she discovered was a vast hidden world of shame, isolation, and tragically wasted potential that extended far beyond her own family's private tragedy. Families across America would give birth to children with intellectual disabilities and immediately face the same impossible choices that had confronted the Kennedys. They could keep the child at home and face social ostracism, whispered conversations, excluded invitations, and the constant pressure to explain or apologize for their child's differences. Or they could send the child away to an institution and pretend they had never existed, maintaining their social standing at the cost of abandoning their own flesh and blood. There was no middle ground in American society, no support systems for families who wanted to love and include their different children, no celebration of what these children could accomplish despite their limitations, no recognition that cognitive differences didn't negate human worth. Eunice realized with growing horror that her family's response to Rosemary wasn't unusual or particularly cruel by the standards of their time. It was actually the norm, the expected response, what any respectable family was supposed to do when faced with the inconvenience of a disabled child. And that realization filled her with both overwhelming grief for all the abandoned children and iron determination to change a system that treated human beings as disposable problems. In 1957, Eunice made a decision that was radical for any member of the Kennedy family, known for their obsessive control of public narratives and family image. She wrote a detailed article for a major national magazine openly discussing intellectual disability and calling for dramatically better treatment of people with cognitive differences. The article never mentioned Rosemary by name, maintaining the family's official secrecy, but those who knew the Kennedy family well understood the personal connection driving her passion. The piece called for increased research funding, better educational opportunities, community support for families, and most radically, the integration of people with intellectual disabilities into normal community life rather than their systematic exclusion. Joe Kennedy Sr. was absolutely furious when the article appeared, seeing it as exactly the kind of public attention he had spent years trying to avoid through Rosemary's institutionalization. This was precisely what he had feared when he made the decision to lobotomize his daughter, that somehow the family's shame would become public knowledge and damage their carefully constructed reputation. But Eunice no longer cared about her father's anger or his political calculations. She had found her life's calling in that institutional visiting room, and no amount of family pressure or patriarchal disapproval would deter her from pursuing it. The article generated thousands of letters from families across America and beyond, parents writing to thank her for speaking out publicly about issues they had only discussed in whispers, for making them feel less alone in their struggles, for suggesting that their children deserved dignity and opportunity rather than shame and hiding. Many letters came from siblings like herself, brothers and sisters who had lost family members to institutionalization and were struggling with guilt, anger, and the desire to make amends. Reading these letters late at night in her private study, Eunice realized she had tapped into something enormous and previously hidden, a vast population of families desperate for hope, support, and the revolutionary idea that their children's lives had value and meaning beyond their limitations. The breakthrough that would transform Eunice's advocacy from personal mission to global movement came in 1968, when she organized the first Special Olympics at Soldier Field in Chicago, an event that was revolutionary in its very conception. The idea challenged every assumption American society held about intellectual disability. Instead of hiding people with cognitive differences, the Games would celebrate them publicly. Instead of focusing on what they couldn't do or achieve, the competition would showcase what they could accomplish with support and encouragement. Instead of shame and pity, the event would create pride and recognition. Instead of exclusion, there would be inclusion on the grandest possible scale. The first Games brought together 1,000 athletes from across the United States and Canada, many traveling farther from home than they had ever been before. For many participants, it was the first time they had ever competed in organized sports, the first time they had worn team uniforms, the first time they had been cheered for their efforts rather than pitied for their limitations, the first time they had experienced the pure joy of athletic competition and personal achievement. Eunice watched from the sidelines with tears streaming down her face as athletes crossed finish lines with expressions of pure joy and triumph, hugged their competitors regardless of who had won or lost, and celebrated achievements that would have seemed impossible to previous generations who had written off people with intellectual disabilities as hopeless cases. But for Eunice, every moment of triumph was bittersweet because she couldn't help but think of Rosemary, sitting in her Wisconsin institution, completely unaware that a movement born from her tragedy was changing the world for millions of people like her. What would Rosemary have accomplished if she had been given these opportunities instead of being subjected to surgical mutilation? What sports might she have loved and excelled at? What friendships might she have formed with other athletes? What sense of pride and accomplishment might she have experienced? The questions haunted Eunice even as she celebrated the obvious success of the games and watched history being made before her eyes. The impact of those first Special Olympics was immediate, profound, and far-reaching in ways no one had anticipated. Media coverage showed the American public and the world that people with intellectual disabilities were not objects of pity or medical curiosities, but athletes worthy of respect, admiration, and recognition. Television broadcasts captured moments of pure human triumph that transcended disability categories and touched viewers who had never personally known anyone with cognitive differences. Families who had hidden their children for decades, following the Kennedy example of shame and secrecy, began bringing them to local programs and community events. Communities across the country started developing inclusive recreational opportunities that welcome people with disabilities rather than excluding them. Most importantly, the national conversation about intellectual disability shifted fundamentally from what's wrong with these people to what can we do to support their full participation in community life. Eunice knew with painful clarity that Rosemary would never personally benefit from these revolutionary changes. Her sister's condition was too severe, the neurological damage too complete, the opportunities for growth and development forever lost to surgical destruction. But millions of other people with intellectual disabilities would live dramatically better lives because of what had been learned from Rosemary's tragedy and the movement it had inspired. Every time Eunice made her monthly visits to St. Coletta and sat with her silent, unresponsive sister in that sterile institutional room, she would tell her about the athletes she had met, the programs that were developing, the changing attitudes she was witnessing, the growing acceptance of people with disabilities. Rosemary couldn't respond or show understanding, couldn't participate in conversations or express opinions, but Eunice maintained faith that somewhere deep in her damaged mind, her sister somehow knew that her suffering had not been meaningless, that something beautiful and important was growing from the ashes of her destroyed life. As Special Olympics grew from a single experimental event to a worldwide movement serving hundreds of thousands of athletes, Eunice never forgot the deeply personal pain that had inspired her work or allowed success to diminish her commitment to the individuals behind the statistics. By the 1980s, Special Olympics was operating in dozens of countries across 6 continents, serving athletes with intellectual disabilities in urban centers and rural villages alike. International competitions brought together people from every culture, race, and economic background, creating a global community united not by shared limitations, but by shared human potential and the universal desire for recognition and belonging. But rapid growth and institutionalization brought their own challenges that tested Eunice's vision and principles. As Special Olympics became more professional, more bureaucratic, more focused on organizational metrics and fundraising goals, there was a constant risk of losing sight of the original mission that had grown from her grief over Rosemary's fate. Eunice fought constantly and sometimes fiercely to keep the focus on the athletes themselves rather than on the organization, its leaders, or its corporate sponsors. She insisted that every decision, every program expansion, every policy change be made with one fundamental question in mind. Does this actually help people with intellectual disabilities live fuller, more dignified, more integrated lives? This question became her North Star, her unchanging standard for measuring success, guiding every choice regardless of external pressures or internal politics. The personal cost of this lifelong mission was enormous and often heartbreaking for someone who had already sacrificed so much for her sister's memory. Eunice's marriage suffered under the relentless pressure of constant travel, advocacy work, and the emotional toll of fighting for social change. Her own children sometimes felt neglected and abandoned as she poured her energy, time, and attention into helping other families' children achieve recognition and opportunity. Critics within the extended Kennedy family accused her of drawing unwanted public attention to their most carefully guarded private shame, potentially damaging the political careers and reputations they had worked so hard to build. But Eunice pressed forward with unwavering determination, driven by the haunting memory of her sister's lost potential and the certain knowledge that millions of families around the world were still struggling in the same isolation and shame that had consumed the Kennedys for decades. In the 1990s, as Eunice entered her 70s and her own health began to decline, she was forced to reduce her travel schedule and step back from day-to-day operations of the organizations she had built. But she insisted on continuing her monthly pilgrimages to see Rosemary, now an elderly woman who had spent most of her life in institutional care, aging, without awareness or understanding in the same Wisconsin facility where she had been abandoned half a century earlier. These visits became increasingly difficult and emotionally devastating as Eunice watched her sister's physical decline accelerate, knowing with absolute certainty that Rosemary had never truly lived the life she deserved, had never experienced the joy and achievement that the Special Olympics athletes celebrated regularly. During one of their last meaningful interactions, when Rosemary was still occasionally responsive to familiar voices and faces, Eunice brought a photograph from a recent Special Olympics World Games competition. She held it close to Rosemary's face, describing in gentle detail the smiling athletes, the cheering crowds, the medals and ribbons, the pure joy of achievement and recognition. For just a moment, perhaps triggered by her sister's voice or some distant memory of athletic activity, Rosemary seemed to focus on the colorful image, and Eunice thought she detected a flicker of something, recognition or interest or perhaps even pride in her sister's usually vacant eyes. "This is your legacy, Rosemary," Eunice whispered, her voice breaking with emotion she had carried for more than 50 years. "All of this happened because of you. Every athlete who competes, every family that feels pride instead of shame, every person who gets to participate instead of being hidden away, it all exists because your story needed to be redeemed." Whether Rosemary understood these words or not, whether any part of her consciousness could still process meaning and connection, Eunice needed to say them aloud. She needed her sister to know, on whatever level was still possible, that her life had meaning beyond the suffering that had been inflicted upon her. Joe Kennedy died on November 18, 1969, taking his terrible secret to the grave, but even in his final moments, the truth seemed to demand expression. Those who were present during his last hours said he spoke one word repeatedly through his labored breathing: Rosemary. The name of the daughter he had destroyed haunted his final breath, just as her memory had haunted every day of his last decades. Even in death, he couldn't escape the decision that had consumed him from within like a slow-acting poison. His death marked the end of an era in American politics and business, but it didn't end the burden his family would continue to carry. The decision that had seemed so rational and necessary in 1941 continued to cast its long shadow over the Kennedy legacy long after Joe was gone, influencing family dynamics and individual choices in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years to come. The truth about what he had authorized would eventually emerge through the investigations of historians and journalists, but by then he was beyond any earthly judgment or earthly consequences. Joe Kennedy had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish when he first began building his empire in the 1920s. His sons reached the highest levels of American politics, with Jack becoming president and Bobby serving as Attorney General before his own tragic assassination. The Kennedy name became permanently synonymous with power, glamour, political idealism, and public service. The family fortune grew beyond even his ambitious dreams, providing security and influence for generations to come. But none of these tremendous successes could give him back the daughter he had sacrificed for ambition, couldn't restore the trust he had betrayed, couldn't undo the fundamental betrayal of parental responsibility that had defined the last 3 decades of his life. The empire he built was constructed on a foundation of guilt that slowly consumed him from within, hollowing out his sense of personal achievement and turning every victory into a reminder of his greatest failure. In the end, Joe Kennedy's life became a perfect cautionary tale about the ultimate price of unchecked ambition and the danger of placing power above love. He had been willing to sacrifice anything, including his own daughter's humanity, to achieve his goals of wealth, influence, and political dynasty. But success built on such a morally compromised foundation could never bring genuine satisfaction, only deeper guilt, more profound regret, and the growing awareness that some prices are too high to pay. The decision that was supposed to solve a temporary family problem became the source of a family curse that lasted for generations and influenced every major decision the Kennedys made afterward. Perhaps the cruelest irony of Joe Kennedy's entire life was that he never lived to see the positive changes that eventually grew from Rosemary's tragedy and his terrible decision. The Special Olympics, founded by Eunice, the disability rights movement that gained momentum partly from the eventual revelation of Rosemary's story, the advances in medical ethics that would prevent future patients from suffering her fate. All of these beneficial developments grew partially from the horror of what had been done to her. Joe died in 1969, believing that his decision had been purely destructive, never knowing that something beautiful and meaningful would eventually grow from the ashes of his terrible choice. When historians eventually uncovered the complete truth about Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy and the family's decades of silence, they found the story of a man who had gained the entire world but lost his soul in the process. Joe Kennedy's empire survived him and continued to influence American history for decades. His political dynasty continued to shape national conversations about public service and social justice. But the man himself had been hollowed out by guilt and regret decades before his physical death. He had haunted his own life more effectively than any external enemy ever could have managed. The patriarch who built America's closest approximation to a royal family died as a broken man, destroyed not by his business rivals or political enemies or external failures, but by his greatest apparent success, the terrifying ability to get exactly what he thought he wanted, regardless of the human cost.